Peace, friends. I'm Pastor Tom Arthur from Sycamore Creek Church, the lead pastor and the planting pastor for our new Eastwood Campus. And it has been a rough couple of weeks for us here in the Lansing region with the mass shooting at MSU's campus, Michigan State University. And the other day I was sitting in a coffee shop with Paul Lepley. Paul's a partner of our church, and we were meeting to talk about launching this new campus. And I said, Paul, help me understand your job a little bit, because you were a chaplain of the National Guard.
Still am.
You still are a chaplain, but then you moved to Washington, D.C., and then you moved back, and you said to me that your new job was a violence prevention expert.
Yes, sir.
And I was like, Paul, how are you sitting on this secret here? This is where the conversation is at right now. I mean, this is where all of our hearts are at, is how do we do something to make this less likely to happen again?
Right.
Not just here in East Lansing and Lansing, but in the whole nation or perhaps the world. So we're here tonight to have a literal fireside chat at the church church's pastor's house, and to pick your brain on what you do as a violence prevention expert in the National Guard, and how what you do and what you know might inform the conversation we're having about violence prevention more broadly. But before we get to all of that, what's this week been like for you?
The last week, so I'm finishing my doctorate there at Michigan State.
Yeah.
And so the halls that were involved, you have Berkey and the Union. My academic hall's right between the two, sandwiched between them, and we teach out of Berkey. So my advisor's wife having to shelter in place right there on that first floor when it happened. It hits pretty close to home. Two of my fellow students, they had to shelter in place and were there for hours. So getting that news, and then earlier that day, my daughter was in the same building where was in Berkey. For like an orientation, because she's transferring to Michigan State next semester. And so it really shows how tragic this can be. You know, you're going through your normal life, and then all of a sudden one person can come in and just shake it up in a way that's just so salient and permanent.
Yeah. This moment of violence that killed 3 people, wounded 5 more, just ripples out so far. It's not just the one person or several people. It goes to the whole campus, and MSU is so big.
Yeah.
And this is going to have a statewide impact, a national, perhaps international impact as well. So as we dive into this, you had a disclaimer you wanted to share.
Yes. So I am currently technically active duty, just don't mind the facial hair. And so what I say tonight, it's from Paul Lepley. It's based off of my academic research, and it's well informed by the different policies I have to write on my military side. So it is not the official view of the government. You know, if I say something dumb, don't sue the government, sue me, or actually sue Tom, because he's hosting us tonight. So
Please don't sue us.
Yeah, please don't. But it's not the official view of the United States government. It's a big thing.
Yeah. How'd you get into this work?
Yeah, so, life's a journey. Going back to even my middle school days, right, where I loved playing music. And so I was, through high school, being asked to play taps for funerals. I have a family who was in the military before me. My grandfather was in the military in World War II. And so I always had this ethos of, military service, like selflessness. That was ingrained within my childhood. Well, over time, I decided I was going to go in the military, and I figured, well, what better way of going in the military than joining the military band?
Okay.
People don't realize that the United States military is the largest employer of musicians in the world.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I joined the military band as a trumpet player. I actually enlisted as a command bugler. So one of the last command buglers, I think 2 weeks after I enlisted, they got rid of that job within the military. And they turned us all into trumpet players. So I joined the military and found myself doing taps a lot of military funerals. covered Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana through like the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so I was on orders so much one semester, they threatened to fail me from all my classes because I was playing taps so much at these funerals. And going to so many military funerals, you see a lot of different things. It really is kind of eye-opening. And we had the Hillsborough Baptist protest going on at the same time. So although I didn't have to experience it, friends of mine had to experience that.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it is. But one of the things that really caught my attention was how families fared during those funerals. Some families, they weren't necessarily sold on mom or dad being in the military. You'd see some families come together, other families fall apart. And so I wanted to really do something to really impact those lives and serve not just the service member, but their family as well. And the only position that really seemed to make sense to do that is the chaplain.
Okay.
So after 6 years of playing taps and being in an Army band, I answered the call and went to seminary, got my seminary degree in 2.5 years, plowed through that thing, and became a chaplain to help serve families. When I got back from overseas, I got hired in full-time with the state of Michigan to oversee the relationship education programs. And that is really where things really started to turn to help me fill that calling that God has placed in my heart was in those types of programs. It's actually what my doctorate's in. It is relationship education and how it affects not just the relationship health, but the psychological health and even the suicidality of people who go through them. A lot of times when we think about programs, we oftentimes just think that's very specific to a certain thing that we're trying to improve, like relationship health. But what we see in the research is that these programs can actually have spillover effects into other domains of people's lives.
Okay.
Yeah, when we think like, there's a big study going on, Rodney, Rhodes, and Doss, 2020, and they found that these types of programs, which are built to help a relationship, have spillover effects into psychological health. They have spillover effects into physical health. They've shown decreases in substance use disorders. They have impacts in domestic violence by reducing domestic violence. So the effects of a normal, like a simple little program can have such a large impact.
So you're giving us a foreshadowing deeper into the
We
conversation.
are, yeah.
But let's talk first about you. You work right now in preventing violence.
Yeah.
What are the kinds of violence you're trying to prevent?
Yeah, so there's several different forms of violence that the DoD has noticed. They really are not moving the needle on over the last 10 years. When we look at sexual assaults, there's been a 300% increase in reported cases of sexual assaults within, I believe, the National Guard alone. Now, part of that statistic has to do with reporting, and that the DoD is making efforts to help encourage reporting, so that is going to automatically create a rise. But still, a 300% rise is alarming.
That's a lot.
For suicides over the past 10 years, we've seen it's been statistically stagnant. So although it goes up and down a little bit each year, when you look at the numbers for 10 years, it hasn't moved. And this is despite efforts across the Department of Defense to bring down these prevalence rates of suicide, sexual assault. For the National Guard, there's a couple other areas that they specifically look at, family violence, domestic violence, child abuse. And we don't have any numbers on that for the National Guard, at least none that we can really point to with any strong degree of confidence that this is what the number is.
Yeah.
So looking at those several forms of violence.
It seems like, you tell me if this is a fair estimation of what you're trying to do here, is you're trying to prevent people who are trained to do violence on the battlefield not do violence to themselves and to others when they come off of the battlefield. Yeah,
so it's just, a lot of people who perpetrate never even seen a battlefield, especially as we get later in post Iraq and Afghanistan, we have a lot more what we call slick sleeves, people who never deployed. But I think it's important to note that the military is a cross-section of society, and that the people who put on the uniform, they come from civilian lives. And everything that affects their lives in the civilian world, they bring with them into the military. And now the military has to deal with that. There was a study that I remember seeing, or at least I heard about, I didn't see it. A friend of mine said that when looking at suicides, that a lot of the suicides that were happening in the military, people already had a lot of the risk factors before they even came into the military. And so now the military owns that person and has to actually work to help them out through the trials that they may face.
Yeah, the military is a sort of microcosm of the whole demographics landscape of the United States.
Yeah, and with it, comes familiarity with firearms. So when we look at suicide rates, the most at-risk group of people for the military for suicides, they're oftentimes more lethal because they have a familiarity with firearms that
Yeah.
a normal person may not have.
They've been trained to use that firearm in defense of the country, and that violence then ends up spilling over into dying by suicide.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yep.
There is a tension here, I think, that is worth spending some time reflecting on, and the tension that these are folks who are trained to use violence, and you are trying to prevent violence outside of that training. I mean, talk us through that tension a little bit.
Yeah, I've had more than one general raise their eyebrows with that whole concept. We invest hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars into somebody to be violent in defense of our nation. And now we're telling them not to be violent in these other cases. But we see that throughout the military specifically, that there's shadow sides to things. We have military ethos, military ethics. For example, within the Army, we have leadership is the acronym, spelled incorrectly: loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, personal courage. Leadership, missing a couple letters
Okay.
there, right? Mm-hmm. And we instill these values in our service members from day one of their service. And we do that by really breaking them down. We get them, I remember when I was at Fort Knox, doing our long ruck marches, right, where your feet have blisters on them, your legs hurt, you probably have 100 plus pounds in your pack, so your back hurts, and you've been going for miles. And you get to the bottom of this hill, which is the last hill before you get to the barracks, and there's a little placard there that says loyalty. And you just talk, man, life sucks. I hate this. Why did I do this? Honey, why did you let me enlist? Duty. And man, I can't stand this. Respect. And so when you're in this broken down state, you're getting indoctrinated with these values that are meant to help you persevere through adverse experiences. They're meant to give you a moral compass when you're in a morally ambiguous situation. And they're also intended to prevent you from significant psychological harm. However, the issue is that within the military is that the shadow side of those. When you look at selfless service, for example, I have to be in the fight and stay in the fight and sacrifice myself to sometimes win this fight. But in so doing, you might neglect your psychological well-being. And we see that a lot with psychological health rates within the military, right, where somebody just wants to stay in the fight, but they keep on sacrificing their own well-being, which then in the long term takes them out of the fight. Whereas if they would have dealt with it early on, it would have helped them out.
You brought up before with me the Soldier's Creed.
Yeah, I don't have it memorized.
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead, read it.
Yeah. Well, it feels a little weird to put this in my mouth, because I'm
right.
not a soldier, but it says, I am an American soldier, I'm a warrior and a member of a team. I serve the people of the United States and live the Army values. I will always place the mission first. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. I will never leave a fallen comrade. I am disciplined, physically and mentally tough, trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills. I always maintain my arms, my equipment, and myself. I'm an expert and I am a professional. I stand ready to deploy, engage, and destroy the enemies of the United States of America in close combat. I am a guardian of freedom and the American way of life.
So, how old are you, Tom? I think we might have our next recruit right here.
Yeah, you think so?
We're looking for some more chaplains there.
I don't know. My feet will kick me out of
I'm sure they will. Yeah, so when you sent me the questions for today, that's what came to mind was the Soldier's Creed. When we look at that creed, when we break it down, we'll see several elements, and we have to understand that words have meaning. And what shapes that meaning to a large degree is the culture in which we live. So breaking that down, looking at things such as I'm a warrior, and we think about where we get these images of the warrior. I think of mass media, I think of movies, I think of movies like 300, maybe the movie or the show Vikings that was on the History Channel. And when we look at that word and we interpret it through that lens, we see a warrior as somebody who's not necessarily just selfless, but maybe somebody who is a little less than kosher and copacetic, somebody who will use their power for personal gain, which goes right in the face of the non-commissioned officer creed, by the way. And we see things such as, I always maintain my arms, and how does that affect? Okay, so I maintain my arms for violence. There's a couple other elements in there. Being trained and proficient in my warrior tasks and drills, for example. And if we understand it through an ethic that doesn't really show love, compassion, caring, sacrificing for the other person, and see it as a way for personal gain, of taking what I want, it can be distorted. But also within the Soldier's Creed, we see some protective factors. Being a member of a team, we know that social connectedness is a protective factor. That's something that prevents some harm happening later on in life. We look at things such as just the whole ethic. Why do we have professional codes? What is the profession of arms? And when you look at those ethics, of professional ethics, I'm a licensed clinician in the state as well. We have those ethics because we're set apart. We're set apart to do good. You have the Hippocratic Oath for a reason, to do good, do no harm. But sometimes people can take it and twist it, unfortunately.
It's like there's this sort of yin and yang that exists
Exactly.
in that, with violence both in defense and then violence that could turn to the shadow side, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely.
So then, if that's the kind of violence that we're trying to engage or prevent, how are we preventing it? And you sent me a lot of reading material.
I'm surprised you went through it.
Some of it was a little dry, but
I wrote some of that. Thank you.
it was the Department of Defense and now I'm forgetting.
Prevention Plan of Action.
There you go.
Yep.
Prevention Plan of Action 2.0. And one of the lines from that was, first, primary prevention requires a holistic, comprehensive approach driven with unity of effort toward the desired end state. So people have had that on the screen. They're looking at it right now. Unpack that sentence for us.
Yeah, so holistic. We'll start with that. When we look at a lot of violence prevention efforts, they're really stovepiped. We look at, I've heard people talking about, well, now we need to have a bunch of gun reform in Michigan. Well, that's a pretty stovepiped effort.
Okay. What do you mean stovepiped?
So it's just focused on that one thing.
Yeah.
When we look at violence holistically, we understand that pretty much every single form of violence has shared risk and protective factors. So, for example, if I'm looking at domestic violence and if I'm looking at suicide, for example, as two violent forms, we know that they have the shared factors of financial well-being. They have education as a shared risk and protective factor. The higher education, the less likely you are to suicide and to abuse your partner. Matter of fact, the relationships, when we look at the Department of Defense Suicide Event Report for 2021, which is the most current version, we see that a failed relationship precipitated over 45% of completed suicides.
Wow.
Yeah, and so the thing is that we don't think typically that if I help this relationship be strong, I'm preventing a suicide, because we're so focused on just preventing the suicide. And when we focus just on that, preventing that one form of harm, a lot of times we shift our focus to more intervention as opposed to prevention efforts. We see the Department of Defense focusing on Escort, which is a suicide intervention program that the Army has. You have bystander interventions. But at that point, something's already precipitated a harmful act, or at least a harmful thought. And it becomes to be much more difficult and much more risk, and we'll get to that in a second.
Yeah. So if you're just joining us right now, I'm Tom Arthur. I'm the pastor at Sycamore Creek Church in Lansing, Michigan, and the planting pastor of our Eastwood Campus. I'm here in my fireside chat room with Paul Lepley. He is a chaplain for the National Guard. He's also a violence prevention expert for the National Guard. And we're talking right now about what he does in his job as far as prevention violence. And in a little bit, we're going to turn the corner. We're going to explore how his specialty or his subject matter expertise might apply to this bigger conversation where we're having right now about mass shootings, about what happened on MSU's campus, and so forth. So we've been talking a little bit here about holistic approach versus, you called it a stovepipe approach, like just a one-lane approach maybe.
Yep, those ivory towers of excellence.
Yeah. So we've got another piece from this action plan, prevention action plan, and it reads, in short, The public health approach examines the environment and the culture in which individuals live and seeks to fundamentally change the local community in ways that stop harmful behavior before it begins. And something I see in that quote is this relationship between individual responsibility and communal responsibility,
Yeah.
individual actions, and how we together make up a culture, a whole system
Yeah.
in place. Talk to us about individual prevention versus communal corporate.
Yeah, so I was talking to Sarah about this earlier, it's my wife, and she said, make sure you incorporate this. I'm going to try to remember to incorporate that as soon as it comes back to me what that was. But prevention is everybody's job. We all have a role in prevention. Our daily activities have direct implications on preventing violence in that community. And when we look at more societal, and we all have, society is the sum of the whole, right? It shapes that entire, what we do shapes the entire societal focus on prevention. But specifically what the PPOA is talking about within that sentence is talking about what's called the socio-ecological systems theory.
Okay, say that again.
Socio-ecological systems theory.
Okay.
So if you want to look more into that, you can look up Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He was a sociologist out of the University of Chicago. A really brilliant guy. And he came up with this, we call it the kitchen sink theory because it throws everything into it and explains a lot, right?
Okay.
But what this theory does is it, again, looking at holistically, it looks at doing things at the individual level. So making sure that we focus on ensuring that people have positive coping skills, for example. Make sure that they have access to resources. So looking more at the community level. We have their interaction with other people in their life. So make sure they have effective skills to communicate, especially when under duress. We look at more community things. So you can know that somebody lives here in Lansing, right? So what are some things that the community in here has to offer us to help prevent violence? You look at streetlights, for example. There was a case example that's on the CDC website that talks about a large-scale city that noticed an uptick in violent crimes in a certain area. And so the police department worked with the local hospital, and they put their data sources together to understand more holistically what was going on, and they're able to zero in to a very specific area where these crimes were happening. And how they went about solving it was simply by installing streetlights to make sure that there wasn't enough darkness there where people could perpetrate a crime and then get away from it.
That's a really different approach than just adding more police to that corner.
Yeah, exactly. Look at Missoula, Montana, I believe it was. They had noticed an increase in sexual assaults within their community. It's a college town. There's lots of bars. And so they worked, the college and university worked with the local police department. They also worked with the local bars in the area. And they decided they brought in an expert. They decided to train all the bartenders and to intervention training. So if they saw something that was happening in the bar that looked like maybe somebody had too much to drink, then the bartender was trained to intervene in that situation either directly or indirectly. And by doing that and getting all the bars in that town on board, they're able to see a decrease in sexual assault cases.
That's an amazing way of thinking about public safety. That's another big conversation right now, particularly with the Black Lives Matter movement, on defunding the police or not, and if there's other ways to do public safety. And you just described an effort that basically turned the bartenders into public safety officers.
Exactly.
That's a way more communal approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. But the thing with that story, and both these stories, is that it takes a community. Mm-hmm. It's not an individual effort. The police are not going to stop violence. Mm-hmm. Police are there to intervene, largely. And hopefully, if we do our job right, they won't have a job to intervene in. We can look at public spending, for example, in the U.S. When we look at how our dollar bills are being spent, as a large community, as a society, roughly $2 of every $3 that we spend goes to intervention and response, whereas $1 goes to prevention. In other countries around the world, you can go to Norway, for example, it's the opposite. It's $1 for response and then $2 for prevention. Mm-hmm. And so you see completely different outcomes because of that. Now, going to shadow sides, that means that the U.S. we're really good for responding to things, especially medical issues. You'll see the princes from Saudi Arabia come over here for their heart issues, because we were so good at response and maintenance after the fact. But yet we don't really invest the time to prevent it from happening in the first place, which is ideally what I would like to see as a person.
Yeah.
One last level, socio-ecological system theory, is that outer valence, and that's the society as a whole. And so here we're looking at policies. So your gun control policies would be an example of that outside valence of the socio-ecological theory and how we can diminish the harm from happening. The thing is that you have to make sure you hit every single one of those levels, those 4 levels, effectively to bring down the violence that we see.
I think we've got an image that you shared with me that we can put up here that's the 3 levels of prevention slide. You want to talk us through that just a little bit? What are people seeing as they're looking at that on the screen right now?
Yeah, so relying on my photographic memory here. So there's a waterfall there. We oftentimes use a waterfall analogy to talk about getting upstream of harm. When we look upstream, we can go just a little bit upstream. We can look at things such as how communities are structured. We can look at things on positive coping. We can get a little bit further upstream. We can look at education, making sure we have secure education, education that's effective education. Make sure that we promote higher education. We know the more education somebody has, less likely they are to perpetrate a crime, a harmful crime. And we can get even further upstream. We can get prenatal, up to several generations through epigenetics. There's a phrase out there in a field of study, it's still emerging, called epigenetic transgenerational inheritance.
Yikes.
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
Say that again?
Epigenetic transgenerational inheritance. And so that's studies, they're pretty much, I believe they're done out of the University of Washington, where they've taken rats, these families of rats, and they've exposed them to different environmental toxins. That could be allostatic load or stress load. It could be overcrowding. It could be different toxins in the environment. And what they see in these rats is that by living in these environments that are not healthy, is that there's a genetic marker that gets ingrained in the DNA, and that then gets inherited down to 4 generations.
Wow.
Yeah, so we've seen this in human populations when we look at Holocaust survivors. There was a study looking at their children that they had, the children that they had after the Holocaust had elevated cortisol levels in their blood. That's because of a genetic change in their DNA. I haven't seen studies out on it yet, but we look at the slave syndrome, post-traumatic slave syndrome. I forget the exact cause, but they're looking at people who are descended from slaves and how there's genetic marks that are attributed to that. And so this points to making sure that the interventions or the things that we do, we're not just looking at equality, but we're also looking at equity. And that there are people in our communities, giving somebody a box to look over a fence might be good for one person, but somebody might need 2 boxes. And that's what the whole purpose of a public health perspective of prevention is.
Yeah. Reminds me of a book I read while I was in college called American Apartheid.
Yeah.
And it was about the projects on the south side of Chicago and how you have, through racist policies and so on, you have poor black people stacked on top of each other. And you're saying then that potentially has long-lasting biological implications from one generation to the next.
Yep.
So racist structures get transmitted through biological processes from one generation to the next.
It's still an emerging science, so there's a lot we can learn from it. And there's a lot more we have to do. I think there's Great Britain published a study looking at Vietnam War veterans, that their kids, that the sons only, not the women, not their daughters, were more likely to abuse alcohol, were more likely to live a shorter life because of what we think is the epigenetic transgenerational inheritance.
Yeah.
There's a couple other things on that slide too. We look at risk. So the closer you get to the waterfall, the greater your risk gets. And so we want to get people, further upstream. But next to that risk sign is, I think it's put command climate or command control. Because we as people, we can't necessarily just affect that thing, the epigenetic transgenerational inheritance, way upstream, because we just don't have that within our abilities. So it's important for us that when we think of violence prevention, to focus on the things that we can actually do to mitigate violence ourselves.
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit deeper again in the prevention plan on this line of how different groups are impacted in different ways. Here's what it says. Within large organizations, specific subpopulations are at higher risk of different forms of abuse and harm. For example, current data show that young white men are most at risk of dying by suicide in the military, while women, racial, ethnic minorities, and sexual minority individuals are most at risk of sexual harassment and sexual assault. So talk to us here a bit about how racism and racialized dynamics come to bear on both violence and prevention.
Yeah, this is where I wish Sarah was in the room because she's much more studied on this. Um, you know, we're a subsection of, the military is a subsection of the larger society. And we know that things such as patriarchy, racism, they have lasting and indelible effects upon how we think and how we process things. And so when we look at, again, equality versus equity, we know that there has to be targeted interventions for certain demographics of people because society's just treated them differently. That they don't necessarily come from the same background that a white middle class or upper class person comes from, and therefore might need a little bit of a different approach than just a generic, boom, blanket approach. Like we're going to solve all the problems with this one program, or this one policy, or this one plan. It's just not going to happen.
If you're just joining us, I'm Tom Arthur. I'm the pastor at Sycamore Creek Church, lead pastor, and I'm planting pastor at our new Eastwood Campus. And I'm here with Paul Lepley, who is a partner at Sycamore Creek. He's also a chaplain in the National Guard, and he's a subject matter expert when it comes to prevention violence in the National Guard. And we've been talking about him being an expert on preventing violence and what he does in his job for that. But I want to take what he's doing in that job and what he's learned and start to apply it a little more broadly to the broader conversation that we're all having right now about how do we prevent things like the mass shootings at MSU, the United States having just an off-the-charts experience of mass shootings, school shootings. And let's take what Paul has learned and turn to that conversation right now. Again, thank you for being with us tonight, Paul, and sharing your knowledge with us. I'm amazed you subject matter expert is accurate. You're sitting here with nothing in front of you, spouting study after study after study of how different academics and experts have applied this or researched this. But let's take a look at what we can learn from that research and begin to apply it to this broader, can we apply it to this broader conversation, and how might we begin to do that?
Yeah, so going back to that waterfall slide, you can only control and only focus on what you can control and focus on. When I was thinking about what we can do today, I think about how we invest our time and our money, who we vote for, what policies we advocate for, larger policies across the U.S. and Michigan. Gun control is just one small piece of the pie. What other policies are out there that are needed? We look at the distribution of wealth. This is something that we can look at focusing on as well, specifically along schools. Your marginalized schools that might be in impoverished areas, they don't have a tax base there to fund that school. So how do we use our funds at the local level to help those schools out, not just putting it into response efforts? So again, it goes back to voting. Your millages, how are you voting on those millages? Who you're electing into office is important. I'm here in this position that I serve in today because we've elected some people into Congress who said this is an issue and we're going to do something about it. And so what they do, they said we're going to fund this whole new initiative, never been done in the DoD before. And then they said, hey, you need Paul Lepley, you need to come to the National Guard Bureau to set this whole thing up. And so I get a phone call when I'm up in Grayling saying, you need to be down here tomorrow and to DC. And so I turn around, throw everything in my Jeep, and I drive down the next day, right?
Welcome to the Army.
Yeah, well, I've been in the Army before that, yeah.
National Guard.
Yeah. But also thinking about what we can do ourselves, educate yourself about violence prevention. There's a book that I recommend, Getting Upstream, that I think is on one of your closing slides, is one way to educate yourself.
Yeah, the Dan Heath book.
Yeah, the Dan Heath, yep, New York Times bestseller.
Tell us a little bit about it. The subtitle of that is "The Quest to Solve Problems Before They Happen." Why is that book helpful, or what's the gist of that book?
It changes the paradigm in how we think about prevention. When in the military setting, when I talk prevention and talk about the prevention workforce that I helped stand up, leaders say, "Don't we already do that?" Because they think, "Oh, intervention is prevention." But when you think of a public health model to prevention, it focuses on the who and the when. The who for public health prevention is focused on the community. It's not focused on an individual. It's not a clinical intervention. And when, it's well before there's an issue. When we get, again, as we get closer to that waterfall, we start to go from the population down to the individual level, the closer we get to that waterfall. And it's going to takes a lot more time, energy, and effort to be able to help intervene as opposed to preventing it upstream. The challenge with that is that the further upstream we get and the further away from the individual we get, the harder it is to say that our funding of that school after school program prevented that burglary from happening 5 years down the road. So there's some challenges getting upstream, but that's the long and the short of it.
Yeah. This reminds me, I mean, before I ended up getting married and going and working at a church and being called to be a pastor, in another life I was going to be a community psychologist. And community psychology is the area of psychology focused on prevention rather than on the other side of disease. So, like clinical psychology, which I didn't have any interest in doing, was you're depressed, how do we help you get undepressed or manage the depression? Community psychology was on what factors need to be present in a community so that less people are getting depressed in the first place. And that prevention perspective seemed to me to be a really essential part of the conversation that we don't focus on enough. And a lot of it had to do with the assets that are present in the community. Like you say, an after school program. And it's interesting, you're right, I think, in saying it's harder to say then that this one little program stopped somebody from dying by suicide or stop somebody from being violent in their home with their kids or their spouse or partner or live-in.
All right, and it's not just one program. You have to have a multitude across the entire ecology of not just programs, but also training and education, and then processes too that are in place to help prevent harm from happening.
Yeah. It seems that the current conversation, and understandably so, is really focused on gun control. And United Methodists, unfortunately, have a sort of horrible serendipity that happened last week where the day after the shooting, we were organizing for an advocacy day around gun violence on March 22nd. And I've signed up for that. I'm participating in it. I love it. Like, we're giving people online training before you show up. You'll be at Central United Methodist Church right across from the Capitol for a whole day with your legislators coming through for you to advocate for gun violence prevention. And at the same time, what you've described is something even bigger than that, where it's not just about gun violence, it's about a whole holistic landscape of care and thriving in the community.
Yeah, it's all levels of the ecology, from the individual out to the societal level. We need to hit every single level with what we do to help prevent harm. Gun control, another thing that we can look at is lethal means safety and storage within the Department of Defense. When we look at suicide specifically, we know that it's an impulsive act by the numbers. It's the first 5 minutes of that thought are the most critical time in that person's life. So now we're looking at secondary prevention, not primary prevention. So making sure we delay that thought delay that thought from becoming an action. And the same is true for a lot of other forms of harm. Just slowing down that person enough, making sure that firearm is in a locked box, or they have to think about unlocking the box before they pull out that firearm, can deter suicide. And there's large-scale studies happening right now in the DoD on that specifically.
Yeah. When you look at the trend of violence in our culture, particularly mass shootings, through this lens of violence prevention, holistic approach, what do you see?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm optimistic and pessimistic all at once.
Okay.
The science, we know the science is true and that it is preventable to a large degree. And I don't want to be Pollyanna. I think that no matter what we do, there will always be some people that we just cannot prevent from causing harm.
Violence is, to a large extent, preventable.
Yes.
I
Yep.
think that's important to say for people to hear, that violence is, to a large extent, preventable.
Exactly. Yep. The pessimistic side of me looks at the way our media is structured, the things that our media can promote, cultural things such as promoting individualism and self-actualization over a collective communal identity, I think can be problematic. And those things, I think it's important to say that primary prevention isn't something that happens overnight. It takes months, years. When we did our projections, we don't expect to see the needle move on prevention for 5 years. And that's with that's hundreds of millions of dollars going into what I do across the National Guard alone.
Wow. Yeah, that long-term view of 5 years to see something move.
And that's just a small little change.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, and that also goes to bore people with the statistics. You have to make sure you have public health numbers to be able to track things over time. And a lot of times when we think prevention, we don't have good numbers to go back to.
Yeah. So, again, if you're just watching, I'm Tom Arthur. I'm the lead pastor at Sycamore Creek and planting pastor at our new Eastwood Campus. And I'm sitting with Paul Lepley, who is a partner at Sycamore Creek. He's also a chaplain in the National Guard and a violence prevention expert for the National Guard. And we've been talking about what he does when it comes to violence prevention and how that can be applied to this broader conversation we're having about violence prevention in our culture, particularly in the wake of the shootings on MSU's campus last week. So, Paul, you're also a chaplain. You've been trained just like I have as a pastor. We've studied a lot of Greek and Hebrew and who knows what else. And you have this sort of place of faith in your life.
Absolutely.
At least from everything I've known about you, these are the center points of our life, our heart, our soul, our mind, our whole body. And how does faith play a role in prevention, perhaps both for you as somebody trying to prevent violence and somebody who is struggling with their own, perhaps, violence in their life?
Yeah, so from preventing first, I think of my faith in the scriptures that I grew up with in the good old Baptist church. You have your Awanas and memorizing all those scriptures, and it provides an ethic that we can use to take forward. Caring for the orphan and the widow, that is a primary prevention verse right there, because we know that orphans or people who are in financial hardship are going to be more likely to end up on the ending or receiving end of harmful acts. We look at caring for the sojourner, caring for the person who is less than. We also have an ethic of being inclusive. Jesus sitting with the tax collectors, Jesus talking with the woman at the well, and doing these things that were totally countercultural because he was not, you're different, stay over there, but come here, let me show you love.
He crosses racial, economic
Exactly.
barriers all the time.
Yep, yeah. And then from a personal side, there's a strength that we can get from our faith. There's a strength that I know that when I'm in a hard time, that there's, through my faith, I don't want to say and pray my way out of it because that's a little too Pollyanna, but I know that there's hope, that through that struggle that there's hope on the other end of it, and that I will make it through because I've been through similar situations in the past. And there's examples that we can see of people who've gone through hard times through Scripture that we can go to in times of hardship. The stereotypical Job, right? He went through a really hard time, and people who go through hard times can really make some poor choices and decisions, but we can make it through it.
This reminds me of when we were sitting and talking in the cafe, and we're talking about launching this new campus. And this campus, this church, Asbury United Methodist Church, that we've adopted has a licensed kitchen. And so we are working on turning that into an incubator kitchen for people, for small business owners, people who cook in their their home kitchen, and then they sell that at farmers markets or in local markets and so on. And you said to me,
Primary prevention. There you go. 101.
yeah, that helping somebody improve their life economically is an act of love.
Yep.
It's
Absolutely.
a prevention strategy.
Yep. Yeah, and finances are tied to so many different harmful acts. If there's financial insecurity, if there's job instability, if you're living in a food apartheid, those it all shows. This is how you show that you're going to have increased risk for harm.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you about some resources for people in just a minute, but I want to talk to everybody here on the screen just for a second, because if you have a question you would like to ask Paul, I want to invite you to put that in the comments, whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. I'm looking at both of those on my computer, and we're going to ask him any questions you may have. Maybe we'll read some of the comments as well and give you a chance to reflect back on those comments. But what are some, you already mentioned one resource, and that's the Dan Heath or Chip Heath book. Is it both of them? The Heath brothers write a lot of books together, and they're always good.
Yeah, so that's one I'm aware of. I think there's a second one out there too, but I haven't read it yet, so I don't want to endorse something I haven't read. But for violence prevention, integrated prevention specifically, which is my area of focus, the CDC has a dedicated suite of resources out there called the Veto Violence. So if you just Google CDC Veto Violence.
VITO.
Yep, VITO. Yep, that'll take you right to their website, and just a slew of resources there, especially a suite of, like, if you actually want to get into this field of doing violence prevention, they have all the tools you need to walk you from point A to point X, Y, Z, right there on the CDC website. There's also a community clearinghouse out of the University of Kansas, I believe, that it's a very exhaustive list. So if you haven't had your morning coffee, probably should have that before you go to that list. Just a lot of resources, again, take you from start to end on planning and carrying out programs, policies, and plans to mitigate harmful acts.
Some good resources. Thank you for sharing them. I'm reading through some of the comments here, and we have people from North Carolina listening in. We got people locally from across the state of Michigan. Thank you all for joining us. And Heather Walsh has been listening. Heather is one of the pastors. She's also a chaplain in charge of this Advocacy Day. Heather writes, I think everyone wants an approach to be holistic. Social work has talked about protective factors for a long time. Stovepipe can have an immediate impact when proven. Research supports these things because the holistic approach takes a longer time to develop and build. It's often the starting point.
Yeah, there's also some, unfortunately, within the DoD, some territorialism, that people get scared that if you come in and try to cross these programmatic lines, you're going to be taking their job away. And so there has to be tact and doing holistic prevention.
We are both married to a Sarah.
Yes.
Your Sarah says, I'm thinking about the stream waterfall, and that there's so many areas that people can and are putting their efforts and talents. Think about in that way, like a stream or requires a lot of tributaries feeding into it upstream. So everything we do as a church, just providing strength to the community, assets to the community.
Was that your Sarah, my Sarah?
That was your Sarah.
Oh, she is listening.
She is listening. Rebecca Fitton, the Fittons are listening, says, yes, so many entrance points. People are adding the book to their list, their reading list. Somebody mentions High Price by Dr. Carl Hart. I'm not familiar with that, but so I wonder if, just to close up here, you might put your chaplain hat on right now and speak to people who are struggling or hurting. I mean, and in some ways, like we were talking before we even started, you and I have had our own struggles and hurts through this week. So We don't as pastors or chaplains stand outside of that. We stand in the hurt and the pain with people as well. But put on your chaplain hat for a little bit, for just a moment here, and talk to us as with your pastor's heart in the wake of what's happened here at Michigan State.
Yeah, I think it's important that we all remember the people who lost their lives. First off, we need to honor that memory, and as much as can celebrate the time that we had with them if we knew them personally. We need to also remember the people who were wounded and are wounded. I think some people have, we have had 5 people who were critically wounded last week. Looks like they're making great gains, but I think all of us to some extent or another were emotionally wounded and maybe mentally wounded. And that those wounds, it's going to take time for them to heal if they heal. I study post-traumatic stress. Sometimes some wounds don't really want to heal, but I think it's important that as we try to continue on living our lives, that we remember that we're part of a larger community, and that if there is something that we need, if we see that somebody needs help, that it's important for us to remember that we are part of that community and can reach out for that help or to give that help as is appropriate. And then for those of us with faith, just encourage you to work with your congregation, work with your pastor if you need to, get that counseling, do whatever it takes to care for you, and it's okay to take a knee sometimes too, to let what happened sink in, and to hopefully get your courage back up to continue on living as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Paul, so much for being with us tonight. I think, what did I ask you just a couple days ago to do this?
Tuesday?
Yeah. Thanks, of course, to Randy, our video guy, who I asked yesterday if he was willing to do this. And you're heading out of the country tomorrow, so you did this on the eve of international travel. Thank you again for your time tonight. Friends, Paul mentioned leaning on that community, and if you want to connect with us at Sycamore Creek Church, we want to encourage you to do that through sycamorecreekchurch.org/connect, and know that there's a place there where you can write a prayer request, and there's a team of people who are praying for you, but then there's a whole community that are taking steps together to provide the kind of assets to our community that Paul was talking about that prevent violence, whether it's the arts, whether it's the poverty reduction, whether it's advocacy at the Capitol. Connect with us through that link, sycamorecreekchurch.org/connect. We also just want to let you know that we are launching a new campus, and we brought on a new pastor at our South Lansing campus where I have been a pastor at, and I'm going to launch that new campus. It's across from Eastwood Town Center, and one of the things that I'm really excited about is making that building, as we're remodeling it, into a community performing arts center, particularly for community theater groups, that there's not 100 to 200 seat affordable community theater in the Lansing region. And here we've ended up with a building and the ability to remodel right across from a destination shopping and eating center. And I've been encouraged, Paul, listening tonight to you talk about this and how things like that perhaps feed into this bigger prevention strategy, whether it's the incubator kitchen and the licensed kitchen in the basement, or it's giving a place for people, a stage basically for people to share their art. And so if you'd like to be part of launching that new campus, be in contact with me, drop me a private message, connect with us at sycamorecreekchurch.org/connect, and leave a comment there as well. Again, we are so grateful that you have joined us tonight. And Paul, would you close us with a prayer?
Sure, absolutely. Let's pray. Gracious God, we thank you for just this time together, even if it be online, to just sharpen our axes, sharpen our swords, and to become a little better equipped to go out and serve this world that we live in. And as we do that, Lord, I pray that you would help us to remember the 3 lives that were lost at MSU last week, the tens more that have been lost this year due to gun violence, and that we would not grow weary of doing good, that we would continue the fight to prevent this violence, that we would do our best as churches and congregations around the U.S. to provide safe places, places of harbor and refuge, and places that help to support and build communities to prevent violence from happening in the first place. Be with each of us, Lord, as we go here from tonight, and bless us and keep us. For it's in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Peace, friends.